Okay, let's get into it. So this part of the winemaking session will start to sort of delve a little bit more into the style that, some of the sort of leading styles and some of the technique that goes into making these. But just quickly, a little bit about my shed. So Howard Park began in 2006 with the Jetty sparkling program with one wine and one dream to be to produce some of the best sparkling wines in Australia. And 18 years down the track, we have a slightly bigger portfolio of wines, around 4, and a couple of special release wines that come out every now and then. But and we've also built upon our base of buying fruit in now to purchasing our own vineyards and specifically growing fruit for sparkling. So as some of the viticultural team has alluded to, very much going back and specifically looking at growing from nose to tail with sparkling in mind. I joined as a Howard Park Chief Winemaker in 2021, and it's been a lovely homecoming for me to come back from South Australia with myself and my family now. But I was previously the Senior Winemaker Manager for Accolade's Tintara Winery in McLaren Vale, which is the premium winemaking hub for Hardy's and the House of Arras. And for the 12 years I worked with Accolade, I've always worked with the sparkling program and had a great privilege to work with some wonderful people, some great fruit, and some great techniques and technology across the Yarraburn, Grant Burge, Hardy's, Sir James, Omni, Bay of Fires, and of course Arras brands. But what we're here for today is the wonderful world of sparkling. Sparkling has some of the most liberal rules when it comes to winemaking. So there's some things we can do in sparkling you can't really do in table land, and certainly a different range of techniques as well. And with all of these different options comes a great deal of choice and many variables, but obviously a lot of decisions. And stylistically, it's easy to get a little bit overwhelmed about where you're going to go with your wine when you're starting out. So there's a myriad of different stylistic pathways and variables available to you. So using style as that focus for yourself when starting out going down the sparkling pathway, it's a really handy to ground yourself in one of these sort of stylistic pathways and then sort of move out from there. Sparkling production, the guidance usually, I suppose, it very much revolves around these styles, and because you have to lay out a substantial amount of time and effort, and you should really put a great deal of thought into this selection of your style, so that you can deliver it the first time, and make sure you're not wasting those big capital resources, but also the resources that you're putting into your variables as well. So today we'll look at some of the leading stylistic pathways that you can go through, and we'll look at these in terms of oxidative, reductive, oak influenced, a blanc de blanc, a rosé, and extended aging. So it's probably worth pointing out as well that although these can seem like really rigid boundaries, that there is always a little bit of crossover between some of these styles, but certainly these are sort of the leading pathways. So moving quickly into the oxidative styles. So oxidative styles introduce a controlled amount of oxygen at various stages during vinification. The most common form is fermenting and aging the base wines in either oak barrels or vats. Hang on, I think I've got the wrong one in there. Sorry. So basically it's a combination of relying on that sort of passive or active oxidation when you're preparing your base wines. The characteristics in these wines tend to be a little less fruit obvious, leaning more on those nutty, toasty characteristics. The palates tend to be a little bit softer and richer, and plusher in their approach, and generally the perception of the acidity that is in the wine is is generally lower. So you tend to use less sugar. These wines can be incredibly complex and amount for some of the sort of leading styles, things sort of like Krug and Bollinger. And there's certainly some technique within there. It's certainly popularly applied as well as a way of mitigating the amount of phenolic finings. So instead of using your protein-based finings, whether they be animal or plant, using a lot of air during your base wine preparation could be a way to reduce that load and give it a little bit more stability. It's usually applied to more of the red fruits, so Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier. They tend to be a little bit more resilient, given they've got a slightly larger phenolic load to handling that either passive or active oxidation. And generally the wines will look, a little bit more approachable, softer and rounder in their youth, as compared to sort of reductive winemaking, which can look a little bit restrained and fruit-driven in its youth, but then they sort of even out along the way. It's a style that does use, I suppose, more out of a mechanism of an oak barrel being quite porous and allowing oxygen in. It does rely a little bit on oak use, and we'll touch on that in the next in one of the later brackets. And also as well, sort of full malolactic and high reserve wines in these particular styles. So really rich, deeply complex style of wines, usually quite approachable in their youth. So moving into the more reductive styles, and these tend to emerge when the polar opposites to what you're seeing in oxidative winemaking. So really taking all those steps, like you would say with table wine production and things like your aromatic whites, really look to avoid the amount of oxygen exposure you have throughout the winemaking process, and that can sort of manifest in terms of the amount of sulfur that you're using in the field, to reducing the amount of, the type of press extraction that you're having, but also to sort of fermentation temperatures, things like cell counts as well when you're going into the secondary fermentation as well. The higher ones tend to produce more reductive wines. But generally the characteristics are sort of bright in primary fruit and floral, and then as they sort of age, those savoury, sort of flinty, toasty aromatics come to the fore, but the palates are bright and crisp, and sort of lingering acid lines as well, probably more pronounced in their acid structure. This is a style that can work for quite well in terms of sort of carbonation, as we sort of seen in the first wine in the previous bracket. Where you want to retain those aromatics on a wine that's meant to be drunk relatively youthful. So in terms of oak influence, I suppose in the early days of sparkling production, there wasn't a great deal of choice but to use anything other than oak. So this has been, I suppose, a historic standpoint that's been maintained by some houses into the future as oak being part of their style, whereas I suppose a broader shift had been to using more stainless steel tanks later on as they became more available and cheaper, and this oak style has sort of remained left behind to a handful of producers who have really refined those styles and then embraced the complexity that you can derive from them. Again, richer, nuttier, full-bodied wines, they do require a little bit more time, I think, in tirage to really soften that tannin profile, but do really well in terms of the complexity that they bring from that additional time. I think oak tannin is really good for giving length in the palate, and as Trina said you can use it at base wine level, but you can also use it at dosage as well. So there's sort of two opportunities for you to do that. I think you get a more overtly nutty character and toast if you're using it at base wine level, particularly when it goes into that more reductive environment in terms of secondary ferment. There is a degree of risk, I think any characteristic that you put into sparkling wine is generally going to be more amplified than when you apply it in table wine. So the mechanism of bubbles coming through gives a lot more volatiles being released aromatically into the consumer's nose. So you've got to be a little bit careful about handling those oak applications. So there's a degree of risk there. It can very quickly dominate. So I think unless you're going sort of whole hog oak, even in the more advanced sort of larger style sparklings, the oak percent ranges from that 5 to 1%. It's still quite low, usually the examples. The really strong examples, although do apply the oak in quite a precise manner, where they have really short early oak exposure in very much seasoned barrels. So again, about toning down that oak tannin and those really vibrant characters, because they're going to come up once you add bubble into it. Yeah, so let's move on. Okay, blanc de blanc, so white from white. So traditionally is from 100% Chardonnay, but there are many different varieties that are white. So sometimes some other varieties can make their way in. Bottle of sparkling for anybody who can name the other champagne varieties that are all also permittable. That's one. There's another 2, 3, 4, 6. Pinot Blanc. Yes. Well done. You get the bottle of fizz. You got the tricky ones, but you do work for a big. You do work for a big champagne house. So those varieties are obviously permittable in the blend, and things like Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc can give a little bit of body to the Chardonnay that goes with. But generally, if you're looking at a Blanc de Blanc, it's pretty much going to be 100% Chardonnay. These styles are really marked by the reflection of the Chardonnay grape, so really strong citrus characters, lovely fall aromatics in the youth, but as they age, they get a little bit more nutty and toasted brioche characters. Because you get really, you're sort of prizing that sort of really bright reflection of Chardonnay. The cooler sites is probably where it generally performs better. Where you get, that better acid retention. You're not starting to push Chardonnay in a hurry into that tropical space when it advances quickly. Again, a really great wine for reflecting where it's grown. Sites that are heavier in chalk, you tend to get a nice chalky minerality through them. Sandier sites, you get this sort of mineral softness to them. Flinty sites, it's a bit like Riesling. It is a great variety to transmit exactly where it's grown. Okay. Just get the next one. Okay, we move through to rosé. So, a little bit disappointed to see some of the rosé sales starting to dip in the earlier report, but this had been a category that had been in growth for a couple of years, so as all things rosé had been within Australia. But I'm sort of asking the question where the colour is king. I think the perception's certainly changing within table rosé winemaking, and we're starting to see that in sparkling as well, that those almost super pale anemic looking rosés are drawing questions about whether they're what they mean in terms of rosé. So there is a swing to using the full spectrum that's available to you. And In terms of what we're primarily looking for is a bright red fruited aromatic wine, quite crisp and creamy, and usually the traditional variety used is Pinot Noir. It's primarily constructed by 3 methods, whether you blend a bit of dry red into the base wine, into a white base wine, to achieve a colour before you put it through secondary fermentation. There's obviously the process as well where you can have that base wine being produced with colour from the very start, so you're holding the must in contact with the juice and getting a bit of maceration before you go into the first fermentation. These wines tend to be a little bit richer and fuller and a bit more red fruit aromatic, a bit more primary in their approach than the blended base wines, which tend to be a bit more savoury. And then you've always got another chance to have a go at dosage or completely colour at dosage. So using a little bit of dry red, usually some Pinot, something that's really low in tannin, in your expedition liqueur can just give you a nice, can either lift up the hue that you've already had or make that wine completely rosé. And these tend to be, again, a little bit more crisp and probably a lot more savoury than the first two methods. Consideration as well should be given to certainly a bit of a trick in terms of your expedition liqueur, making sure that you're doing a lot of your trials with the SO2 regime that you're going to be using in bottle, because that's obviously going to have a big impact once you put the expedition liqueur in. There's nothing worse than waiting or working out later on that the colour you thought was right but hadn't put the sulphur in is now very, very pale. Cool. So our last of our stylistic categories is extended aging. So most of this particular style is done by extended aging in terroir, so in contact with the yeast lees, and that's where most of the flavour you're going to see coming from these particular wines. They're really rich and nutty, and then they sort of move into this lovely seaside savoury earth and toasty note. They're incredibly complex. And they really rely on that slow extraction of the yeast, the manoproteins and oolitic compounds, polysaccharides from the yeast cells that really build mouthfeel. They have, an effect on keeping the bubble size nice and small as well. So they tend to have that lovely creamy sort of bead to them as well. But you also got to consider as well how your base wine is going to age, and that's something that we sort of, in Sparkling World, don't probably talk about a lot, is if you take that base wine and put it into a bottle with a screw cap and then let it age at the same time, you'll see that base wine will develop over time as well. So the contribution that you have from the aging of that particular wine is also a factor that must be considered when you're looking at extended aging. So certainly this is one you should be done with a little bit of trial and error before you go down the 10-year-old path, because it can be a very expensive proposition. And then I suppose there's something that, and this sort of moves a little bit outside of the extended aging period. Really, when we're producing a extended aging wine, we're really prefacing in the range of tirage aging rather than tirage and then sitting on cork for a really, really long time, or half on time under tirage and half under cork. The range of characteristics you get from aging under cork are very different to what you get in tirage, and I think there's certainly a time limit on how long you should be aging your wines on cork. There's a sort of a loose rule of thumb, but however long it's been held under tirage, that's the kind of probably the cut-off window for how long you should be aging it under cork. But I think there is probably a limit to that of around sort of 3 to 4 years in terms of how that rule of thumb is applied as well. In terms of a sort of summation, these are some of the leading sparkling styles. But there's always, and this is sort of a really basic siloing of some of these particular styles, but as there is with all winemaking, there's always an exception to these rules. And I suppose one of the examples working on the House of Arras program, which is quite a reductive style, we would quite often vinify 5% of our base wines in oak as well. Or a house like Ruinart, Blanc de Blanc, employs pretty reductive techniques, but it also ages its wines and uses a lot of reserve wines in their blends as well. So there's always this bit sort of cross-pollination between these styles. But I suppose if you can use this as a starting point, then you can build complexity on your journey in sparkling. And I think that's fundamentally one of the wonderful things about sparkling is you do get this chance to move a wine through a really different range of stylistic sort of pathways as you move on, using all these levers that we have available to us. So it's complex, it's difficult, but it's incredibly rewarding. So I really enjoy it, and hope you guys too.